Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for another Woman in Space seminar series. My name is Sarah, and I'm joining you from Toronto today, the traditional land of the Huron, Wendat, the Seneca, and the most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. As a planetary scientist and an educator, my responsibility towards the Indigenous people is to learn about Indigenous knowledge and make space for Indigenous teachings. As someone who lives in Toronto around the Greater Lakes region, I take the responsibility to be a good steward for taking good care of the land that I inhabit. I just wanted to take a quick moment to also thank our sponsors for sponsoring the conference and also the wonderful seminars that we are planning to have monthly. Today's talk is about something that we don't often talk about failures. I think we should talk about that more often. I'm not going to take too much time. I'm going to introduce our wonderful speaker for tonight. We have got Isa Peterson, who is the Director of Product Strategy and Development at Benchmark Space System, guiding the technical decisions and strategic goals for the product family. She's an inquisitive astronautical engineer with a background in orbital mechanics, mission design, and manufacturing. She's managed numerous commercial programs and has experience in customer mission planning, orbit raising and maneuvering, spacecraft mechanical testing, and product development. She is also, she loves learning, dancing, and video games. And when she grows up, she wants to be an astronaut. So with any further ado, we're happy to welcome Isa.
Okay, so starting off this presentation right, starting with a technical failure on my part of trying to get my PowerPoint going. So give me 1 second. Yeah, this is fun. Everybody loves a good slow entry, right? Okay, so hi everybody, my name is Isa. Thank you, Sarah, for that wonderful introduction. I'm really excited that you all are joining me today. I see there's 108 people participating, so no pressure, right? Let's just like lean into all of the failures that I've done. But I think it's super important as well to talk about how we've grown as people, how we've failed upwards, failed downwards in our career. And I'm super excited that you're gonna join me on this journey. So 1 second as I get my screen going, you're just gonna see that sad desktop for a quick second. And all right. So you should be seeing just one slide right now that says lessons learned in failure. And then I've got the script running at the bottom. If anybody has any technical difficulties or if something bombs halfway through, it'd be very in line with the theme of this presentation. So just, message at the bottom because it'll pop up and I can see it and hopefully we'll fix it. Okay, so thank you for that introduction. My name is Isa. My current position right now is Director of Product Strategy and Development, but I also like to say that I am a fierce learner of lessons. So I have learned a lot in my career, in college, and I'm excited to share it with you all. Oops. So just a little bit about me. I'm from the Midwest, so apologies, everyone is now going to pay attention to the drawing out of all of my vowels. You're going to hear me say all the O's and the A's pretty ridiculously. So I apologize for that one, but now that you're hearing it, you can't unhear it. So my undergrad, I went to Carthage College in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where I studied physics as my major and minored in math and Spanish. From there, I decided to go to grad school. So I went to Purdue University and got my master's in astronautical engineering, focusing on astrodynamics. There, I was also a TA, and I worked for the Indiana Space Grant Consortium. So I want to throw a little shout out for them. After graduating from Purdue, I took on my first big kid role and moved to the West Coast, to Palo Alto, California, where I got my first job at a large aerospace company, then called SSL. Now it's part of the Maxar family. SSL, for folks who don't know us or don't know the name, they're a large aerospace manufacturer that builds school bus size spacecraft. So I feel like a lot of us are probably used to the teeny tiny little boxes, but this company makes the Sirius FMs, the direct TVs, everything that's huge and awesome. There, my first job was supporting the orbital dynamics department. So my job was to plan all the maneuvers for different varieties of customers that would get them from low Earth orbit all the way up to geosynchronous orbit, where they would operate for 10 to 20, even sometimes more years. At that company, I had the opportunity to do a really awesome rotation program. So I supported not only orbital dynamics, but I did a stint in mechanical systems engineering, production, and then after that, I went on to join a cool team that was kind of like a skunk works organization, where we worked on developing new products for the company that would kind of help us shift into different product markets. And that's where I got my big love of product and product development. So after I got a good chunk of time in the big aerospace world, I decided that I would join the startup world, and I joined a company called Tesseract. We did chemical propulsion systems for spacecraft and larger. So this was my first entry into the fast-paced world, and I absolutely loved it. So right now, I'm still in the startup world, and the director of product strategy for the company called Benchmark Space Systems. And here we have a little bit larger of a team, but it's still fast-paced and super exciting. So before I go on, I just want to say that I'm also a really huge fan of dance. I'm a big proponent that everybody should have outside activities. So I want to highlight that I love dancing, love music, because I think highlighting stuff that's a little bit different about us than our professional life makes us more of a human. So yay, dancing. Okay, so there's a couple different things that I could talk about for a presentation, even do an hour-long Zumba dance party or something, but why focus on failure? So I took a picture of my tweet the last tweet that I sent, which is talking about success, snooze fest, brag session, unoriginal, talking about failures, definitely relatable. And if I mess up this presentation, I can use it in future iterations of this presentation, and oh no, what have I done? But the original origin for this talk was I was approached by one of my former professors who was teaching a technical program management class at Carthage College. And he asked me, can you give a talk to my students and tell them what it's like to be a program manager? Talk about your lessons learned, how you've gotten to the position that you are now, what's product. And I was thinking well, that's not super exciting. And as much as I like to talk about school and the projects that I've done, it's, unrelatable. It's kind of boring. So I decided we'll lean into failure, because everybody makes mistakes and it sucks. We're all afraid of talking about it. We're all afraid of making mistakes, and it all really comes down to fear, right? Like, you're afraid to make a mistake, and of course we are, because society tells you that it's not good. You're going to ruin your reputation, all of the things that embed us in our mind that makes us totally afraid of stepping outside of the box. But it's important to fail. In Silicon Valley, there's the whole idea of failing fast and failing upwards and just continuing iterating. So the minds out here are pushing it. And I think it's because every time you make a mistake, you're going to see something in a different light. So I decided, okay, it's super uncomfortable, and hopefully it's not super obvious, but I'm uncomfortable now still talking about it, because it's not comfortable to lean into all the ways that you failed as a human. Naturally. But let's just go ahead and lean into it. So the structure of this talk is, I did a little bit of research in the Harvard Business in psychology of failure. And apparently there are 3 main types of failure. And I figured, let's talk about all of those different types of failure and lean into it. So the first type of failure is the preventable failure. And this is exactly what it sounds like. This is a failure that had you had the knowledge, you have the knowledge, and you definitely have the ability to prevent it. So also, side tidbit, I know that we have a nice mix of folks in the audience. So I'm going to do, for each of these types of failures, I'm going to talk about a mistake that I made in industry and a mistake that I made in academia. So it's a lot of failing. So in my academic history, I quickly learned that graduate school is hard. As I'm sure there's probably a whole bunch of people in the participants all cackling now because grad school is hard. So coming out of undergrad, I was riding high. I got really great GPA. And my first semester at Purdue, I took one of the hardest classes that I've ever taken in my life. And honestly, I've never done anything technically, mathematically that comes close to it. And in grad school, this is called a weeder class. So they're trying to cut out all of the folks that came in like me, feeling super confident, super, yeah, I got this, and knock you down a couple pegs. And it sure as heck knocked me down a couple pegs. So for the first class, for one of the first two classes that I have taken in my undergraduate career, or my graduate career, it came time for one of my three classes, or three tests that feed into your final grade at the very end. And I kind of went with my undergraduate preparation planning, which is, look over your notes, look at the homework, but, try to relax beforehand and write out your little note sheet. I should have studied way harder because during the test, I realized that I didn't know the answers to at least 30% of the material. And I felt, relatively confident for probably about 50% of it. And I'm like, okay, this could be bad. But I got my graded exam back and I got a 22% on my first exam in graduate school. And that cut me so deep. So I bombed that exam and I found a group of people to study with in the future, and I studied harder. And on the second of my three exams, I got a 40%. So this was a continual failure on my part to learn how to study, to get a group of people together and learn this material. So the third test comes around and I thought I was doing great and I got a 60%. So I was like, oh, at least it's an upward, right? So in summary, I bombed every single exam in that class, but I made it up on the homework. And overall, I got a C in the class, which is good, right? Except for at that level, I didn't have enough courses and I got put on academic probation, which means I had to take summer classes. And it felt really hard and it made me really sad because I'd come in super confident. But it was a really great learning opportunity for me to learn how to study in a different way, learn how to make a new study group. And, it was good to, just brush it off and keep going. So professionally, I've also had a bunch of preventable failures. And the one that I stood out most notably is when I had to give a presentation for a colleague of mine. I'm used to giving presentations, and in my former role, if you were the lead on a program, you would often have to go up and talk about the design and the current status of your type of analysis for customers, say at your preliminary design review and at critical design review before a spacecraft gets built. So I was used to giving talks and I thought I had a good understanding of this spacecraft. So I went in support of one of my colleagues, and this customer was completely different than any customers that I've ever worked with. And the spacecraft type and the propulsion system was completely different than how I'm used to seeing and used to explaining how this is being developed. So I was talking about something that I was very unfamiliar with, and with a customer that was really stringent. And as such, because I came in a little bit confident, I didn't prepare and I didn't know the math. And so I stumbled through a 30-minute presentation on orbit raising using a repulsion system that I had no idea about. And it felt like I got thrown into the lion's den. It was awful. The questions that they asked were digging, and I just could feel my whole face just glowing red. And it was miserable. But luckily, I had a couple of my colleagues in the background, and I think one of them is on the call now, so thank you, that kind of helped me get through that, through their grilling of questioning and just get me out of that critical design review. So I want to talk about those two things because I feel like those are the things that you see in movies and they dramatize it. And you're like, oh, okay, people don't fail like that. And yes, I have definitely failed like that. Okay, so another type of failure that you often see in movies or in TV shows is a complex failure. A complex failure occurs when you think you have a really good understanding about something and a process, and you have the protocols in place to get you from point A to point B, and everything is, perfectly normal, except for at the very end where it just, falls apart dramatically. This is kind of like what you'd see in those hospital TV shows where a patient comes in and they've got all the symptoms that no one understands. Anyway, you get it. So both of my examples actually are technical from my industrial experience. So sorry, there's no academic background on this one, I just realized. So in one of my previous roles, I supported the manufacturing and integration for a spacecraft. It was a big school bus size satellite, and it comes together at the very end of integration and manufacturing, kind of like origami. So these pieces of this big school bus come together, and it's really, really tight. The spacecraft is built with really compact internal structures, and everything is mounted all on these different panels with adhesives and tape. So there's a whole bunch of different people all working together to get this going. And at the end, everyone and all the different subsystems come together and watch everything literally come together. So during the mating of one of these spacecraft parts, there was a huge interference. And so we're all standing down in the manufacturing floor going, oh my gosh, what happened? Like checking the drawings, everything is fine. All the tolerances are great, except for the fact that there are so many really tightly wound wiring bundles and components that are all held with just a little bit of buffer, that interference was enough to make it really difficult for these pieces to snap together. So we all had to stand down, move things around, shift it around, and then eventually we were able to mate it all together. So this is a really great example of you have all the planning in place, everything is actually meeting the tolerances that are set, but something pops out of just a little bit of tape. So another example of a complex failure is a little bit more diplomatic, a little bit more on the human side of things. So in one of my roles, I supported the Skunk Works organization, and we would often give presentations to the executive teams of our company and talk to kind of the higher level folks that would make the big decisions at the very end. And one of the trades that I was leading in that role was a make or buy. So in manufacturing or in this role, we would often look at what it would cost to build something internally, how much time it would take, and all the folks that would need to support it. And then we would trade it up against what would happen if we just, go find someone that already has something similar, what kind of concessions we need to make in order to just get that thing. And see what kind of mission we'd be able to do, even though it's not the exact thing that we would make internally. So follow the procedure, did all of my math. I put together like a really great bill of materials for both, talked a whole bunch with a whole bunch of different vendors, and came up with a really great scheme that showed what X looks like compared to what Y looks like. And I felt super confident going to the meeting. I've gotten my preventative failure out of the way. I knew what I was talking about. So I stood up at the podium, surrounded by a whole bunch of executives, and presented my results. And much to my surprise, I thought I was giving a really great presentation until somebody started getting really kind of, upset and angry at me. I was like, that's interesting. Um, uh, Worked through that question. Another person started getting a little bit upset and flustered. And then that continued to happen until I felt like I was just getting dragged through the coals. So every mathematical result, or every single question that I could prove I had a mathematical answer for, I had the numbers, everything done, except for I didn't realize that there was a human factor to everything. So the group that I was presenting this result to had invested a whole bunch of energy, a whole bunch of their own time, and they had come into this presentation thinking that I was already on their team, or that I was going to come in and present something that was agreeable to the work that they had done. But that wasn't what I had done. I was presenting or suggesting going with the opposite. And that was uncomfortable for them, and it was super uncomfortable for me, because no one was in agreement, and it kind of felt like, two heads butting. So I learned really quickly from that one to talk to the stakeholders before going into that presentation, and making sure that I understand where everyone's coming from before walking into the lion's den of executives. Okay, so the third type of failure is intellectual failure. And this is the failure that what Silicon Valley claims is that you're fast failing. So this is when experimentation is necessary, you're in the lab, you're building things, you're testing it. And this is often when answers are not known in advance because the exact solution isn't there. No one's done this yet. And perhaps you won't find a solution. So this is kind of like the good type of failing. So in academia, in undergrad, me and a team of folks, we developed a propellant modeling system for the Orion downstream propellant tanks. We're a bunch of physicists that have never built a propellant tank before, and we had absolutely no idea what we're doing. We had never worked with fluids, and we have never had to scale a fluid before. So, completely walking into this completely blind. We ended up having to enlist chemists and folks that could help us machine things. And we had to worry about things like I said, the fluid modeling of scaling down hydrazine to something in a little smaller form factor. We had to worry about containing all of this murky blue fluid. And then we also had to worry about how this is going to react in microgravity. So the cool part about this project is that we were modeling how the fluid would slosh back and forth in a zero-G environment, because that's what space is like, which was super exciting, except for we had a lot of fun processes that we had to work through to understand how to not make a big mess about this. So beyond just even the technical stuff, we had to think about how we're going to get good visualizations on this, how are we going to empty it, because one of the things that we were trying to model is what happens if this tank is filled at different levels. So during our flight, we would have to adjust the levels of fluid. So we worked from the fullest to the emptiest, and our super awesome DIY solution was we used toilet plumbing to make it cheap, affordable, and it worked. It was great. So I'm always a huge proponent of students and folks that are in college to get your hands into projects like that, because you really learn how to problem solve, and you really learn all the people's names at Lowe's or Home Depot, and they can help you build crazy concoctions just like this one. So professionally, I work in the startup world now. So this is like the exact perfect combination for that, where failing fast is everything, and it happens all the time when you're doing new product development. So for us in our startup world, we do the research. We do research on best practices, and going into each new product design or test run, you acknowledge what you do and you don't know. And sometimes you still break things. And that's like an awesome part about working in a startup environment, because every time you have a failure, whether that's a piece of hardware or your software doesn't run, whatever, you learn from it and you keep going. So it's interesting too, because In a startup world, you're often working on developing products for customers, right? So customers might sometimes find this contradictory, since people are still learning to accept failure, in my opinion. So a good example from this, in one of the R&D roles that I had before and for a customer, we were developing a product for them, and the customer was super frustrated with us because as we were iterating on a product, we ran into a couple of errors and a couple failures that we were iterating on to improve and eventually get them a solid working product. In our heads, we knew exactly what we were doing. We had a plan, we knew how to fix it. But we were slowed down because this is happening over Christmas and then New Year's, and folks, just typically aren't available all the time in that window. And we didn't really do a great job of explaining what was happening because in our heads, we knew exactly what was happening. And at the very end, we kind of had one of those come to Jesus moments with them, and it got so much better. So test failures are completely fine. They're expected and they're easily recoverable. But the failure in the startup world is if you fail to communicate that, it can become a much larger obstacle than the technical failure itself. Okay, so I like to say that, when I have conversations with folks and I explain to them what we do, working with propulsion technology, with chemicals, everyone says, oh, that's super dangerous. But for me, I like to say that, yeah, that's dangerous, but so is being clumsy. So I've hurt myself a bajillion times, and it's usually way worse than the actual propulsion technology itself. So I think you might have noticed that I'm intentionally not leading into any of my personal failures. You can find me at conferences if you want to lean into that one. We'll grab a beer and we can talk about that. But I do want to just kind of highlight that it is super important to know your personality defects. And for me, that is one of them is that I'm super clumsy and I'm always off balance. So I have like a few little pictures so I can talk about how fun that is. At a conference, there was a really beautiful sunset and I wanted to take a picture of it. So naturally, I climbed over this really tall fence and fell face first into the grass in front of probably about 150 aerospace colleagues. So that was super cool. In academia, I was learning how to build a breadboard for a laser driver, and had things completely switched around because I was blasting music and definitely not paying attention. And I ended up blowing up a whole bunch of electronic components along the way, and I was super frustrated with myself. And it's super easy in propulsion too. You can touch peroxide and get a little bit of peroxide burn. But anyway, I just wanted to say, for a lot of this stuff, you're the only thing in your way for some of your personal failures. So hopefully that can address that one. Okay, so that's a ton of failing. And according to my PowerPoint, I've been talking 25 minutes straight about all of my glorious failures from college and from my career. So I do kind of want to talk about some of my key lessons learned, because there's the silver lining in everything. So going back to the preventable failures, I think we can all agree that just knowing your stuff before you present the materials goes a huge way. If I had done a little bit more research on the thing that I was presenting on, or had done some studying before taking the exams that I needed to pass in order to graduate, it would have saved me a lot of trouble and a lot of heartache. So again, study and do your research. This is helpful for folks in academia as well as in industry. So if you do a little bit of research and put some time into either your studies or what you're planning on developing, this will help you get leaps and bounds in front of your own capabilities, or leaps and bounds in front of the competitors. Trust but verify. It's one of my biggest lessons learned, or one of my biggest sayings that I took away from the old aerospace environment, and it's great. So this is if you're working with a ton of folks and everybody's drawings or their designs have to come together. And even if you're working with folks that you super trust and you know that they've continued to do great work, it's always important to double check all of the drawings and the assumptions and verify it, even if you trust them completely. On the human side, I learned a really great lesson that you should read the room and remember that everybody is human. So when you walk into meetings, people sometimes don't care that you've done a whole bunch of mathematical verification because they're only picking up on the fact that you right then are proving them wrong. So even if you are right, like I thought I was super right, it's important to acknowledge that folks are coming into high pressure meetings with their own opinion in mind. But I do want to have the caveat that you should always stand up for yourself. There's going to be times in your career or personally that you know that you are right and you need to stand up for yourself even if folks are trying to take you down a peg. So I like to think that it's definitely okay to break things along the way. If you have to break your code or if you need to like blow something up, it's important to do actual testing, to build things and to get dirty to figure stuff out. And then leaning back into my clumsiness, one of my lessons learned is that I should slow down and focus during all of my critical activities, even if that is trying to scale a fence to take a picture of a pretty sunset. So this slide I kind of built for myself, right? Like after going through all of my critical failures in life and all of my personal flaws, I did want to say that even if you make a ton of mistakes along the way, things continue to improve for you so long that you take each failure as a lessons learned opportunity. So I just did want to talk about some of the things that went right even after all of my failures. So kind of how I was talking about the propellant tank modeling, I was able to fly on the NASA microgravity plane 3 times. The microgravity plane is colloquially known as the vomit comet. And if you've spoken to anybody that has flown on this plane before, they'll agree with me that it was one of the best experiences of my life. There's really nothing that can compare to feeling the sensation of weightlessness. So you can see in one of the pictures at the top left, one of the flight aides was helping me go into a somersault spiral, and I nearly threw up, but it was totally worth it. I wanted to do a call out to my undergraduate university and show like a picture of me and my flight team. I flew with an all-woman team, which broke the norm in that organization, comparing ourselves to teams from larger universities that were all dudes. It felt really great to be able to fly with my female colleagues, and that was a huge win for us and in our college. So even though I failed a whole bunch of times in academia, I still graduated with honors. And I was able to get one of the coolest jobs right out of college. So from that, I went, like I said, to SSL, and that role, I literally flew spacecraft. It's so cool to go into the MCC and watch everything happen. So you've built the spacecraft for 2 to 3 years. You put on a rocket, and then being able to fly it and maneuver it and bring it home is just this surreal experience. And in that role, I ended up my ultimate career in that type of work. I was able to be one of the youngest mission analysis directors, and I got to oversee a handful of spacecraft from early proposaling all the way up to customer handover. That is quite an experience. I also got to lead the mechanical design, build, and test of a super complicated spacecraft, that one that I was kind of mentioning earlier. And then, leaning into that previous role, I got to watch it get launched and be there for all of the mechanical separation things. So it was super fascinating, really great lessons learned experience in that world. One of the things that was super exciting about then switching into the startup world is I went from a company that's about 1,800 folks to a 7-person startup. And within the first week, we pushed this huge test stand out, got to fire this engine that you see in this nice dark image, got to make mock diamonds. And then at the end of the week, I gave a presentation to a bunch of tech billionaires, and that was just so cool. So the startup world definitely matches my personality, matches like what I like to do, meeting people and talking. And so it definitely feels like the good things of being in college and in research and development projects as well. So in my startup experience, I got to do a little bit learning about different types of roles too, and got to wear different hats. And one of them is helping the company do pitch competitions. And the highlight for that is I won 2nd place at a pitch competition, and I won $15,000 for the company. So I like to be excited about that. And the big takeaway from all the stuff that went right is, had I not made a slurry of failures along the way, I don't think that I would be anywhere near where I am now, had I not failed and failed and failed again. So it's super important to mess up, like for real, because in my mind, failure is part of success. And if you're not making mistakes, then you're not challenging yourself and you're not growing as a person. In my mind as well, the only failure is fear of failure, because that holds you back. Also, it really hurts to make a mistake, and it really hurts to make very visible public mistakes. So be kind to yourself along the way, because even though it hurts now, it won't hurt later on, or as bad later on. So I know we have a mixed group of people in the audience, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about advice for students. So I like to call them advice for future rocket scientists. And that's based off of this wonderful book that I highly suggest everybody read. Even if you're not in aerospace, this Advice to Rocket Scientists by Jim Longuski is like one of the best career manuals that I've ever read. And I take it with me and I reread it every single time I make a career change, or I try something a little bit more challenging. This book is fantastic, so plug for that book. Everybody go buy it. So stay true to yourself and listen to that inner voice. It'll help you navigate your early college career and understanding what you want to do. So I started in my college career as a film major. And then I did a couple classes in physics, and I was like, oh my God, this is the best. And then as I got closer to graduating, I got to go into those R&D projects and learn a lot more about aerospace. And that's when I made the pivot into astronautical engineering. Leaning into those research projects, it's super important that you make things. So join teams that are building things, even if it's not for a specific class or for specific project. Just learning how to make things with your hands is super marketable for folks that are hiring for their startups. And that leads into continuing to do things that scare you, even if it's harder. A lot of us in college, you have no idea what you're doing when you join a research project, but that's part of it. You'll learn how to use machines, you'll learn how to mix chemicals. It's super important. And leaning into that as well, experience that you get in those type of environments means so much more to us hiring folks for us startups than necessarily your GPA. So stay curious, be super inquisitive, and get dirty. I also know that we have folks that are professionals. So I wanted to do a little bit advice for current and future professionals. One of the things that I thought was super helpful in my career, one of the teams that I supported at SSL, Mission Analysis and Design, every single time we would finish up a program, we would have a postmortem as a team. So everybody gets together, you air your grievances, you say what went wrong, what you could do better. And then after that, everybody did a lessons learned plan to make sure that everything that might have been a little bit of a failure or something that we could improve on gets documented and gets put into your lessons learned procedures. I think that was super critical for us as growing as a team, and it's super helpful for everybody that's in your organization to learn from folks that came before them. But that kind of goes hand in hand with the second bullet, which is that everybody needs to truly welcome the discussion of failure in an organization. And that trees down level deeper into or beyond organization into your team specifically. It's definitely not enough to say that you're creating a safe space if every time somebody brings up something that didn't go wrong, if they're reprimanded for it. So it's one of the things that I've been really blessed with this entire time is that I've always been on teams that welcome the discussion of failure and growth. One second. Okay. This one, I guess, is for folks that are interviewing. In job interviews, don't sugarcoat your weaknesses or your biggest mistakes. There's nothing more cringeworthy to me than when someone is in an interview and they get asked what your biggest failure or biggest flaw is, and they say, oh, I care too much. Like, oh, just gag me, right? So think about it beforehand, but don't use one of those things. For example, my biggest weakness is that I'm like super aggressive about learning things to the point where like I'll ask a ton of questions, and sometimes I feel like that puts off people, and I'm not trying to be mean about it. I'm just like actually super inquisitive. So I've learned to kind of tailor my questioning to be less aggressive and to just let people know that I'm just genuinely interested. So leaning into failure, one of the things is to know when to quit. And there's a great quote by W.C. Fields that says, if at first you don't succeed, try again, then quit. No use being a damn fool about it. So if you're continually running into the same roadblocks or having errors along the way that you just cannot seem to break through or to break past, take a step back, because maybe there's something that you're not seeing, or maybe it just doesn't work and you need to bring in some outside help. And then this one isn't necessarily about failures. This is kind of the opposite. Be careful what you're good at. I think we've all been there where you find something that you can do super fast, or you can do it like more accurately than other people, for example. And eventually your manager or your bosses or your higher ups are going to keep giving you that same type of work because you're good at it. And so be careful what you're good at. Ask for people to take on some of that work as a good training opportunity if that's not something that you want to be an expert at. Because there's a great quote that if you're indispensable, you're unpromotable. So if you can share the wealth and the knowledge, you'll be able to grow beyond that career instance and into more exciting roles if that's something that you're interested in. Okay. So I'd like to kind of talk about how I plan on failing next. So it's kind of tongue-in-cheek. I'm not actually planning on failing because there's from one of my favorite TV shows. If I'm planning on failing is even dumber than regular planning. So thank you, Rick, for that wonderful quote. But this is kind of more so how I anticipate I'm going to fail next. I'm in a relatively new role, and I need to learn a whole bunch of things to be able to do this job well. And I love learning. This is something that, I've been really lucky with since I was a kid. I love learning. I like to take on new activities and new challenges. But kind of like I mentioned a couple slides ago, I tend to take on everything all at once. So like right now I've got the Art of Electronics next to me. I've also got a book on leadership. I'm also learning about like legacy hypergolic systems. So I've just got like a ton of material and I'm just diving into it all at once. So because I'm naturally inquisitive and I'm trying to be more self-aware, I'm knowing that I have a tendency to overwhelm myself. So knowing this, I am preparing to have my little alarms that go off in my head if I start, feeling that anxiety of taking on too much at a time. But I'm super lucky. I have wonderful colleagues that are helping me learn this material faster than if I were just to put my face in a book. Okay, so this is my last slide. I just told you for about 40 minutes or so, all of my failures, my preventable failures, my technical failures, everything that I've done in academia that didn't go right, everything, some of my big flaws in my professional world. So now I have homework for all of you. I'll come find you and, make sure that you actually did this. Just kidding. So my homework to you is to put together your CV of failures. Because I promise you that when you do so, you'll see that a lot of the things that you messed up with along the way have helped you grow to be the professional, be the student that you are today, and the person that you are today. So I am on Twitter, and I would love it if all of you shared some of your failures with me. So at the end of this, please, send a message to me at isapedi on Twitter. And we can talk about failing, because one of my main goals of this, or one of my main initiatives, I guess, in having these kind of conversations, is to normalize the conversation that, yeah, people make mistakes, and so long as you're learning, it's totally worth it, and you'll continue growing. So that is my presentation.
Thank you so much, Isa. That was amazing. I was like laughing at times, so my Zoom kept telling me to unmute. That was so wonderful. Since we have so many people dialed in, if anybody has questions, can you type them in the chat and we'll moderate them from there? Okay, Jen Dawson, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
There we go. Great talk, Isa. Thank you so much for being so vulnerable and sharing so openly. My question was, in those moments of failure, when you're feeling the sting, how do you be resilient? How do you bounce back from failure, build your confidence back up, and take that risk to try again?
Ooh, that's a great one. So I kind of have this little bits of process that I like to do. First off, I love working out. And so when I feel like really beating up on myself, or I can just feel that negative energy, I'll go for a run. Even if it's really slow, or if I like run it, just getting outside and getting out some of that pent up energy has been one of the best things for me to kind of bounce back from it. But on the other hand, I'm also really blessed by having a really strong family and friend network. So if it's like a particularly bad day, I'll, call my parents, or I'll call one of my besties or one of my girls here and back home, and just kind of just unleash on it, and just have someone like walk through with me and be able to pull out the little nuggets and the lessons learned. So talking to my friends, talking to my family, and then just getting out there and putting my feet to the ground and just running to really great music.
Okay, Olivia, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, Isa. Thank you for that awesome presentation. I just wanted to ask that you said that you're a Theist learner, but how do you know when you're taking on so many projects and when to say no?
Yeah, so that is something that I'm still learning how to do better, being perfectly honest. I think one of my cues that I've picked up on is I just kind of have this little bit of anxiety that builds up in my chest. And if I can separate out a whole bunch of external factors, like let's say that, everything else is going super smoothly, and every time I start thinking about work, it starts to just, make my heart palpitate a little bit faster. Then I take another step up and be like, okay, what all do I have on my plate? And if I make the list of everything that I've got going on, it gives me the great understanding of everything that I have going on. And oftentimes when I do that, I realize that I'm thinking that everything is due all at the same time, and it's usually not. So yeah, writing it down, realizing if there's any external factors that are making me also feel anxious, and then addressing just the underlying like pent-up anxiety that I'm getting, which is usually my key to when I'm doing too much all at the same time.
Thank you.
Gavin, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, hi, really great talk. I found it really interesting. And I just had a quick question. Would you say there are no limitations for graduate students currently in academia considering a career in the private space sector?
That's a good question. So I won't admit how old I am, but I've been out of college for a while. Um, but I know that the folks that I engaged with in university, almost all of them were able to find a career pretty quickly after graduating. Um, Admittedly, there's some folks that decided to pivot from the commercial sector into like a different type of aerospace. So I have one of my colleagues that did the same astronautical program as me, and then worked on airplanes. So it's a little bit of a pivot. But I definitely have seen that everyone that I went to school with was able to find a super exciting career after graduation.
Thank you.
Okay, Rukmini, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. Hi, Issa. Thank you so much for sharing your CV of failures. I was wondering what happens when you've worked on a group and you haven't done the postmortem and it's been a couple months, but there's that icky feeling in your chest where you knew you didn't perform 100%. Have you ever reached back out to those members? And I ask this because in particular, I just graduated and I'm going to go work with these peers as my colleagues in the future. And I was just wondering if you've ever reached back out and said, hey, I'm really sorry I messed up.
Yeah. One of my personality quirks or strengths or however you wanted to label it, I am pretty like outspoken or bold or whatever labeling. So if I have an underlying feeling, or if I get that idea that there's something that I need to talk about or apologize to folks for, even if it's been a couple months, I'll reach out and have that hard conversation. Oftentimes I'm usually like manufacturing these scenarios that are way worse in my head than this person that maybe I let down on a project is probably doesn't even remember who I am. But for me, it's also really helpful to get that as like a learning process and just doing my own postmortem internally and building on my own lessons learned. So yeah, definitely if you want to talk about some ways to improve on a project that you did even a couple months ago, I definitely say do it.
Matthew, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I was going to say, you'd mentioned that thankfully you'd worked in teams in the past where failure is discussed and talked about. But I've definitely worked in environments where failure is not seen as okay, and that causes so much more workplace anxiety. So I was thinking, how would you, if you're in an environment like that where healthy failure is maybe not encouraged, how could you go about shifting that culture in your work environment?
That's a tricky one. I think it kind of depends on the level of role that each person's playing in an organization. So if you're a manager, let's say, that's a little bit easier of a thing to start out to build the culture. You can build the culture within your own team. So grabbing the folks that supported you on a project, or I guess not even a manager, let's say like a project lead, right? Starting small and building that communication, building that safe space, even amongst your peers or your direct reports, is a great way to start it. Even if it's not super comfortable to talk about with a larger organization, developing a small little nucleus of people that feel comfortable doing it, I think will hopefully eventually grow that culture of support and culture of understanding.
Bridget, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. It's been really, really helpful for me. I'm a student, and yeah, that was really amazing. But I was wondering how you would get past imposter syndrome after failing.
Yeah, that's something that I still struggle with. every time I feel like I make a mistake, like even at the beginning of this talk, I was fumbling, trying to get my screen going and, you know, starting to get flustered, and you can start the negative talk. And I feel like most people, even in their later careers, still have that imposter syndrome. So it's something that I'm admittedly still working on now. But usually what I do is I talk to somebody about it, and I have a couple friends, and like I said, my parents and my sister that give me that you go girl. So thank you to all of you that are listening still from that have to deal with me. But you know, internally on my own thing, I like to take a step back, realize that I made a little bit of a mistake, and think about how I would help my friend go through the same process. If I'm beating myself up, if I frame it as if I'm talking to one of my best friends and she's beating herself up about something, what advice would I give her? And usually I say like, oh, I wouldn't want my friend to talk to herself like that. And that's a good cue for me that I'm talking to myself in too negative of a light.
Well, that was perfect timing. Thank you so much, everybody, for dialing in. Thank you, Isa, for that wonderful presentation. Our next seminar will be on July 30th. So we host these at 7 p.m. Eastern, the last Thursday of every month. Stay tuned on Twitter, Facebook for the announcement of our speaker for the next time around. And we hope you will join us again next time. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.